We're getting ready to celebrate the grand opening of Longfellow Park. This project really illustrates what can happen when you collaborate. We've got AARP, CPEX, BREC, the city, DPW, all at the table trying to make this whole entire area a better place.
So I'm Jessica McKelvie Kemp. I'm a vice president here at the Center for Planning Excellence, and I'm really excited about our session this morning, Planning May Affect Your Health. I want to start by thanking our session sponsor, the LSU Ag Center. They have been and continue to be a great partner to CPEX. They've been leading the way in bringing healthy community design to high-need rural communities in Louisiana, and CPEX is really proud to have been able to partner with them on that. I also want to say thank you to the Louisiana Healthy Communities Coalition, who has also provided support to the Smart Growth Summit in the House. And they've been working across the state to build cross-sector relationships to improve health outcomes for residents. So thank you to LHCC as well. We're going to start our session with a brief video from another of our longtime partners, AARP. This video showcases a project that CPEX did in partnership with AARP and other community partners, and is an example of the kind of work we would like to do more of in Baton Rouge and throughout the state. So this is just a very brief video to kind of set the stage for the rest of our conversation.
You decorate the pumpkin, it's yours. So pick it up right here and just stay on front.
Walk on Mondays and Wednesdays. Every Monday and Wednesday, whether it rain or it's cold, we still do our 45 minutes. Walking makes me feel good. And it helped me after I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I had started back walking, you know, my feet was hurting and my hands. And after I started walking and everything, all that felt good. And now I don't have any pains in my feet nor in my hands.
So we're at Longfellow Park, really just such a hidden gem in North Baton Rouge, and we're getting ready to celebrate the grand opening of the park. BREC has spent a great investment in the park to beautifying it, putting a wonderful walking trail around the park and new playground, and then by way of a grant from AARP, the Center for Planning Excellence, along with the city, they've added crosswalks and pedestrian crossings, signage and all that lighting to really make this whole place come alive. It was actually the walking club that served as the inspiration for the idea for this park.
On the edge of the park is the Charles R. Kelly Community Center, where the walking club for the neighborhood meets. They used to walk in the parking lot. And working with Councilwoman Green and AARP and CPEX, started to use the park for walking in the neighborhood. The Center for Planning Excellence got a grant to add improvements to make it safer for them to get to the park to walk around the new and improved trail.
We came out here one morning to see where the walking club walked, and we learned that they just walk around the parking lot. And we thought, wow, the parking lot is only 100 yards from this amazing park. Why weren't they walking at the park? Well, we soon learned that it really wasn't safe for them to walk on the street and to cross over a really busy street in order to get to the park to enjoy the walking trail. So we then thought about, well, how can we fix that? How can we bring all these community partners around the table to really come up with solutions that we could kind of fast track so that the walking club could get to the park?
In this location, let's give ourselves a round of applause.
Well, CPEX is really interested in working with residents to find out what they want, and then really helping them access public and private funds to make those improvements happen in their neighborhoods. So from the walking club, we found out that it wasn't safe to cross the street. It wasn't safe to get to the park. They were walking in a parking lot instead of in this beautiful park, but with a few little improvements, we could help them get across the streets.
We are about health and wellness. We're about taking care of building lives, making sure that people have places to get out. We help build the environment for people to be able to get out, walk, exercise, play, enjoy each other, build family relationships. We do a number of things if we're doing our jobs right.
Well, it's important because number one is health. It's helping you physically, mentally, and we're coming together. We get closer.
Fellowship, talking to each other about church and about movies, or just walking, chatting about the children and everything else, the grandkids, just walking and talking. I mean, it's a good fellowship.
So this here just keep you going physically, mentally, and spiritually, coming together as a family.
We know that we couldn't do it alone. We have to have others. We have to have community partners, and we can do really so much more if we collaborate. And so this project really illustrates what can happen when you collaborate. So you've got AARP, CPEX, BREC, the city, DPW, all at the table trying to make this whole entire area a better place.
We were incredibly fortunate because we already knew from the walking club what improvements needed to happen. So we teamed up with the Department of Public Works and BREC and AARP to really identify improvements we could do in 3 months.
It's exciting, it's heartwarming, it's what we are about. It's about helping to work together to build a better Baton Rouge, and that's what we do.
What's so great about it, it was park in the neighborhood was an asset before, but it was really a park for families, where kids could come play ball, and that was really it. Now with the improvements that BREC has made and connections out to the community center and the post office and the library, now it's an asset that people can access, people of all ages can access.
As people age, they want to live at home for as long as possible in the community that they've known and loved their entire lives. But oftentimes when they get older, they realize that the community might not serve them as well as it did when they were younger. So we're really investing in communities that serve people of all ages and all abilities.
We want to see the people use this park for the purpose it was intended. We appreciate AARP and CPEX and the city parish and the Metro Council who helped us to make this happen. So we're just excited and want to do more of these things around the parish. This is what can happen when we can put BREC funds with grant funds to be able to bring something amazing like this to a community.
And I was looking at the community, how they came out and they are participating, and that's a blessing. Just to have fun, the kids to be able to slide and, just enjoy. And see, like the parents that don't have transportation, they can just walk to the park.
You have to come and see for yourself. Don't listen to what other people say. Come and see for yourself. Come and see for yourself. You're going to want to do this.
Thank you, and thanks to AARP for sharing that with us and profiling that project. That was a great example of a community coming together with local leaders and organizations to make improvements to the built environment that will positively impact several social determinants of health: safe access to active transportation and recreational facilities, public space that encourages social interaction, and improved access to a range of services in the area. It is a great thing that the social determinants of health have been the subject of so much recent discussion and research, and that more and more leaders and decision makers are using this information to guide their work. Understanding the social determinants of health is particularly important in the state of Louisiana, where overall health outcomes, unfortunately, are even poorer than the national average. We also need to be thinking about how we prepare for and manage the health impacts of climate change, increased heat, vector-borne diseases, the stress and trauma of flood, higher flood risk, the possibility of moving. These are all things that we need to be preparing for and thinking about. We also know that poor health outcomes are closely connected to socioeconomic status, and the high rate of poverty in Louisiana means that many of our residents who are grappling with financial insecurity are also dealing with the additional burden of poor health. We know that low-income residents are less likely to live in communities that have the kinds of amenities that support healthy living: access to active transportation and quality transit, safe and affordable housing, public parks and green space, and full-service grocery stores. At this year's summit, we've been talking a lot about resilience, and I want to make a couple of important connections here. Community health, both physical and behavioral, is a key component of community resilience. If people are struggling with the financial, physical, and emotional costs of poor health, they are much less likely to have what they need to be investing in resilience, whether that's flood insurance, rain barrels, a move to higher ground, or training to be part of the new water management economy. Conversely, many of the solutions that support healthy community design also build resilience. Green spaces improve air quality and can mitigate flood risk for surrounding areas. Complete streets offer active transportation options and can also incorporate green infrastructure, improve air quality, and serve as economic drivers. Multi-use developments support walkability, economic development, and social cohesion. These are investments that deliver multiple benefits to communities, and they are key not just to addressing the social determinants of health, but to building the kind of comprehensive, inclusive resilience we've been talking about at the summit. Here with us today for our panel are 3 experts who are each contributing to this field in very different ways. Ask them to come take a seat and I'll introduce them. Perfect. So on my far right is Gretchen Biesing. She is the CEO of Panelists Miami, which is an anti-poverty organization that is doing incredible work at the nexus of climate change impacts, public health, and poverty, providing direct services as well as policy advocacy. Next to her is Jill Robertson, is a principal at DIALOG, which is a design firm committed to community well-being based in Canada. She's a landscape architect and a planner with special expertise in design-oriented public engagement, landscape ecology, and collaborative master planning. And Greg Rucks is a principal in the Rocky Mountain Institute's transportation practice. The Rocky Mountain Institute is a nonprofit organization committed to transforming global energy use to create a clean, prosperous, low-carbon future. Greg is currently doing work to develop an urban mobility lab and exploring ways to measure the impacts of active transportation interventions in underserved communities. We'll start off our session by having each of them say a little bit about their organizations and their work, and then we'll follow with a moderated discussion, and we'll try to make time for audience Q&A at the end. So I will turn it over to Gretchen.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me here today. It's been a real pleasure being here with all of you at this conference. So my name is Gretchen Biesing, and I run an organization called Panelists Miami. Panelists Miami is a nonprofit serving all of Miami-Dade County, which is about 2.7 million people. And as Jessica mentioned, we deploy a number of different strategies in order to do our work. We are a direct social service provider. We provide a lot of financial services. We do health insurance, navigation, enrollment, connection to primary care, health coaching. We also do community organizing, grassroots leadership development, public policy advocacy, and coalition building. So why so many strategies? Because poverty and financial insecurity are really complex issues, and we believe that you need an equally complex response in order to address them. So which issues are we involved in? Well, our mission is to identify and solve any issue that's adversely affecting low-wealth communities in Miami-Dade County. We haven't always worked on climate resilience per se. Our work there began about 4 or 5 years ago when we started hearing stories from our clients and the folks that are participating in our leadership programs about increased flooding that they were seeing in some of their neighborhoods, about increased attention neighborhoods were getting from developers. In the southernmost part of Miami-Dade County, which is very agricultural, we were hearing stories from migrant workers about putting their hands in the soil and coming up with water and with mud. As you may or may not know, South Florida is on porous limestone. So when we talk about sea level rise and flooding, it's not necessarily coming in from the coast and the Everglades as it is coming up from underneath us. So I want to share a little bit about how we see public health and climate resilience, climate change intersecting as it concerns the clients that we serve in Miami-Dade County. So in 30 years, flood-prone locations throughout the county's coastal communities may face roughly 380 high tide flood events per year. So that's at least one a day. As recently as last year, we had about 10 flooding events. Most of them were related to what we call the king tide. This always happens in September, October, November. This can be a perfectly sunny day, but the tide will come in and streets and low-lying areas will flood. The water will come up from underneath and come through the drainage system. Flooding is a concern for a lot of the folks that we serve, not only because of the bacterial content, which is something public health officials worry about, but because it prevents them from getting to and from work, which impacts their financial security. Here's some pictures of a recent, what we call Sunny Day flood event in the city of Miami. One of the projects that we've undertaken, we've enlisted some of the graduates from our leadership programs in a citizen science effort. We're working with a local university, Florida International University, and these graduates are collecting samples of the floodwater from around the county. One of the best ways to introduce climate change, climate resilience to the folks we work with is by talking about their experience of heat. So by 2050, scientists expect that Miami will have 6 times as many days of extreme heat, which is above 105 degrees Fahrenheit per year, than the current average. Right now, the average days of extreme heat, it's more than 24. It's increased since the year 2000. But 151 days of extreme heat, that's a lot of heat. I don't know how many of you have been to South Florida, but you're talking about really elevated temperatures, plus humidity between 70 and 100%. In 2015, we experienced 72.5 more days of summer. So that's extending the summer by almost 2 months. And for a lot of our clients who are longtime Miamians, they feel the difference. They can tell that the summer months are longer. A lot of the folks we work with they may be in subsidized housing or public housing. They may be living in rental units. A lot of them don't have air conditioning. So this poses a number of public health issues. One being the increased exposure to heat and everything that comes with that, especially for the elderly or the vulnerable. Another is increased exposure to mosquitoes. I read an article recently that said that Miami's mosquito season had extended from 300 days a year to 320 days a year. So we don't see many days where there aren't mosquitoes, but especially with the prevalence of mosquito-borne diseases like Zika, this is also a public health issue that will disproportionately affect low-income communities. The annual Miami average temperature is increasing and will continue to increase between now and the end of the century, with the average temperature expected to climb up to 94.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Another issue that we talk about a lot with the folks that we're engaged with is tree canopy and having trees as a way to take shelter, get shade, especially on hot days. A lot of our clients use public transportation to get around, which in Miami means buses. So the picture on top is from Liberty City, which is a historically African American community. Very little tree canopy there. The picture below is of Coral Way, which runs through a string of affluent neighborhoods in the city of Miami and extending down to Coral Gables. So you can see the difference in tree canopy between the two neighborhoods. This is a picture of Hurricane Irma, which came in September of last year. She was a very powerful storm. Miami was fortunate that we weren't hit directly, which is what was expected a few days before the storm. Because Irma was so large, she lasted for a very long time over the entire state of Florida, much longer than a typical hurricane would last, which meant that trees were down, power lines were down, and power was out in a number of our communities for up to 2 weeks. While we didn't see the level of structural damage that you would anticipate with a direct hit or that they saw in places like Houston last year, we did see a great deal of income disruption. Because the power was out and it was difficult to navigate the streets with so many trees down, a lot of our clients were not able to get to work. and there isn't very much of a cushion for many of the people we serve. About 60% of the county lives in what we call liquid asset poverty, which means they don't have 3 months of expenses saved to cover any emergency expenses, which might be time off from work that you weren't expecting, a trip to the hospital that you weren't expecting, a car breaking down, things like that. So just to give you a sense of how this income disruption affected people in Miami-Dade County, after the storm, about a month after the storm, the federal government and the state opened up the DSNAP program. The D stands for disaster. So these are disaster food stamps. Now, to be eligible for disaster food stamps, you actually don't have to meet the normal eligibility criteria. You can make quite a bit more money and still be eligible for disaster food stamps. This is a line of about 50,000 people who are waiting to pre-register for disaster food stamps about a month after the storm. This was the 5th day of enrollment. So every day they saw increasing numbers of people waiting in line. They ended up shutting down this line before they saw most of the people and reopening centers to issue the disaster food stamps another month later. But this gives you a sense of the level of financial insecurity throughout the county after the storm, and also the food insecurity. You know, disaster food stamps are meant to help people restock their refrigerators. So this was pretty overwhelming. I don't think many people saw this coming, unless, of course, they've been paying attention to the statistics about liquid asset poverty. Okay, turning to sea level rise. With 2 feet of sea level rise, which is what we expect by 2060, the county can expect over 12,000 flooded homes, about $6.6 billion in damage, 42 lost medical facilities, one school, 61 miles of road. And by the end of the century, with 5 feet of sea level rise, over 200,000 flooded homes, 75 billion plus in damage, lost property value, 285 medical facilities, 35% of our schools, 23% of our roads will all be underwater. And you can see how the water is kind of creeping in, not just from the coast and from the Everglades, but from the low-lying parts of the county that are inland, that are closer to the limestone. So this is a screenshot of elevation in the city of Miami. The brown area is the high elevation, and then you can see as it moves out, the elevation gets lower. So interestingly, most of the low-income communities in the city of Miami are along that brown ridge. This is where the railroad is that Henry Flagler built. And the communities that built the railroad were the Bahamian immigrant communities, the African American communities, and so they settled along the railroad while more affluent whites moved to the coast. Something that we're seeing now is that developers are recognizing that higher elevation land is going to be increasingly valuable. There was a study published by a researcher from Harvard maybe a month or 2 ago that demonstrated that property values on the coast are beginning to lose their value, or their value is not accelerating at the pace that you would expect, while inland communities like Liberty City and Little Haiti are experiencing an appreciation in value that also you would not expect otherwise. And we do have developers over the past year going on the record saying that they're buying up land in these communities because they recognize that the value is going to begin to increase over time and that this is the best long-term bet. So as this information came to light and our clients living in Liberty City and Little Haiti in particular began to experience prospectors knocking on their doors, offering them cash for their homes, one of our leadership graduates coined the term climate gentrification. So you're going to see in Miami almost the opposite of what you might see in some other communities, where the displacement is occurring because low-income communities are on high ground rather than low ground. So what is Catalyst doing about it? And I'll talk more about this during the discussion. We do a lot of grassroots leadership development. We run a program called Clear Miami. CLEAR stands for Climate Leadership on the Environment, Advocacy, and Resilience. And we train activists. We train them on the science of climate change. We help folks understand the intersectionality of all of these issues: public health, housing, transit, climate. And we provide them access to local government officials, elected officials, so that they can talk to them about their concerns. We also co-founded a local coalition called the Miami Climate Alliance, which is 80 organizations strong, and we've had a number of policy wins in the climate area over the last couple of years. And we're also engaging as many of our clients and leadership graduates as possible in citizen science efforts, in fellowships, giving them money to execute community projects that they think will make a difference, paying them to participate in science and research efforts. And we do believe that this is going to make a difference, and it certainly is helping us have a more informed citizenry. So I'll end my presentation there, and we'll talk more during the conversation.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and take a step back to a higher level. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Jill Robertson, and I'm a landscape architect from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And I'm going to talk about some work that our firm is doing to really bridge the gap between health and design, and look at how our designs can actually help deal with some of these issues around resiliency and health. And I'm going to advance the slide. So DIALOG recently partnered with the Conference Board of Canada, which is one of those government think tanks, to undertake a community well-being study to really start to understand what are the factors that go into a design or need to go into a design to truly begin to have meaningful impact and benefit the people that we're trying to design for. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that. Just to kind of give a little bit of background, DIALOG is an architecture, engineering, landscape architecture, and planning firm with studios mostly in Canada and in San Francisco. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta, so it's significantly further north than where we are in Baton Rouge. But everyone will feel better that it's the exact same temperature in Edmonton this morning as in Baton Rouge. So yeah, it's just like being at home for me, except it's freezing. So the Community Wellbeing Framework was released in July of this year, and it starts to look at the impact of design across 5 major areas: social impact, environmental impact, economic impact, cultural impact, and political impact. And by political, we tend to mean more about sort of social structures within a community as opposed to political influences. But as we've heard in many of the talks today and yesterday, that those political influences are really important as well. And then under those 5 factors, there's a series of domains. So socialization, play, integration, complete community, affordability, resilience, mobility. These are all indicators that start to help us understand how design and planning is really shaping our communities. And then diving down to one further level, there's a series of metrics that we've developed that are both quantitative and qualitative. And they allow us to start to measure how we're actually doing in moving the needle towards more resilient, holistic communities. This is a framework that applies at a variety of scales. So we can look at projects on an ecosystem level, a regional level, all the way down to site building or even interior projects, because these are all scales at which we experience life and we experience our cities. And this is a framework that applies to both urban and rural contexts. And it's really designed to help us understand again, what are the impacts of the choices that we're making and how do they shape the communities. This is a picture from a charrette that we held in our Toronto studio for a campus master plan, and it was originally imagined that the framework would be really beneficial in the early stages of a design project to help understand what do we need to consider, who needs to be involved, who are the stakeholders that need to be part of the conversation, and how do we build the capacity for them so that they're able to participate in a really meaningful and authentic way. However, we've also found that this is also a really good tool for post-occupancy evaluations. So I tend to work with a lot of architects, and in architecture world, the post-occupancy occupancy evaluation is a much more technical thing, and don't even let me get started with the mechanical engineers and the electrical engineers. It's very much, do the lights work? What's the energy performance of the building? And it's not diving into, do people feel happier when they're in the space? Are we allowing spaces for people to be able to connect with their neighbors, their coworkers, their colleagues? So when you start to think about the impact of a design on a much broader scale, it really allows us to start to ask some of the questions I think that will drive meaningful change. So some of the questions that we ask as part of this framework, under the social spectrum, do people feel welcomed? Do people feel included? Do they have access to support systems? And are there places for people to socialize? And it sounds really simple, but I think it gets to some of the heart of these bigger topics that we heard even just this morning in segregation in neighborhoods. And creating spaces for people to socialize is a way to start to break down some of these really systemic barriers. Environmental considerations, hugely important, and we heard Gretchen talk about that in her talk. But it's also about making sure that the design improves the local and both local and global natural systems. It encourages people to get to site in active ways and promotes aspects of sustainability. Economic is something that we don't always think about when we're talking about the design of a specific space or site or a building. But it becomes really important to understanding the resiliency and the impact of that site. So can people enjoy a high quality of life? Is this contributing to the economic vibrancy of a community? I walked around downtown Baton Rouge yesterday and saw a lot of the infill that's been going on, and that's really starting to transform the character and the feeling of the downtown. Cultural aspects become really important for people's mental health, and I think as time goes on, we're becoming more and more aware that public health isn't just about physical health, it's about mental health. And how do you avoid social isolation, create places where people feel connected, they have access to mental health resources, they feel like they're part of the community, and they feel like they're a valuable member of society. These are really important issues that are only going to become more and more important as time goes on, and we become aware of the truly integrated aspects of mental health within our communities and our cities. And the last aspect is political. And again, do people feel like they're stewards of their community? Do they have a sense of ownership? Do they feel that they have a voice that can be heard and an avenue to share that voice? So for all the planners in there, I'm going to give a shout out to my planning superhero, Jane Jacobs. And she talks about the fact that intricate minglings of different uses in cities are not a form of chaos. In fact, they represent a complex and highly developed form of order. It's all of these different aspects of a project, whether it's site-specific, an urban project, or even a rural project, that create vitality. It's the health of our cities and our spaces that's inextricably linked to this design and planning. The creation of a variety of spaces that consider a much more holistic series of factors for the development of cities and spaces and places. One of the great failures of traditional planning at present is that it doesn't think about this. It doesn't address the vitality and the variety that's needed to create healthy and resilient cities. As planners, I think that we have a social responsibility to include people in the development of their cities. They need to have a voice, and we're hoping that this framework can help empower people to have that voice. And ultimately, the goal is to move away from something like this. This is Highway 401 in Toronto, which is actually one of the most high-traffic highways in the world, but it could be the interstate in any major American city. I think this is a pretty generic photo. It's definitely not what we would imagine as a healthy or vital city. We want to move to somewhere like this, where there's bike lanes and multimodal transportation, and Greg's going to talk more about that. Away from the traditional notion of suburbia where it's very connected by cars, people drive right into their driveways, there's nowhere to walk, there's not an opportunity to create those spaces where you bump into your neighbors. And look at investments like this, and this is a picture from downtown Baton Rouge, and I'm gonna assume that I saw nobody out when I was walking yesterday because it was so bloody cold, and for no other reason than that. I think only the Canadian would be out walking around yesterday. And spaces like this is a public market in London, England, and through quick pop-up tactical urbanism, there's this space now where people can bump into each other, they can sit down, they have access to healthy, fresh fruits and vegetables, and there's a space to hang out with their neighbors, to socialize, to be connected to their community. Again, a shout out to Edmonton. This is a picture from a project that we worked on in the city of Edmonton. This is winter, it's not summer, fortunately. But it's a funicular, so a mechanized connection that was developed to access our river valley. Edmonton is a city that has a very steep river valley, and but it's the largest stretch of protected urban green space in North America. So we have more green space along our river valley than in all of Central Park, but because of the grade change, it's been prohibitive for people that have mobility challenges to get down there. So the construction of this public realm amenity has really improved people's access to the river valley, and then they get all of those benefits of environment, socialization, connection to nature. And the last picture, again, is the public market and that ability to go somewhere where you can get fresh fruits and vegetables, run into your neighbor. It has those social, cultural, political, environmental, and economic benefits that really can support the vibrancy and health of a city. So it's a pretty graphic, but we think that it has lots of value in creating a different way and a different lens through which to consider the ability that we as planners and urban designers have to shape our city. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. So I'm with Rocky Mountain Institute, and as the name would suggest, I'm based in Colorado. So similar to Jill, I'm very at home in the cold of Baton Rouge right now. I was actually hoping to see some snowflakes fall. I understand that happens every once in a long while. Would have felt pretty lucky to see that. So still hoping for it. And as Jessica mentioned at the beginning, Rocky Mountain Institute is focused on transforming global energy use to create a clean, prosperous, and secure low-carbon future. My initial focus was really just in mobility, so I started thinking a lot about, with Rocky Mountain Institute, thinking about how to transition the mobility system from one dominated by fossil fuels to one more characterized by electrification and low emissions, higher walkability, reduced vehicle miles traveled, et cetera. And pretty quickly came to appreciate that urban design and planning has a huge influence on transportation options and choices. And so developed more of a holistic view of urban planning and transportation that we've since tried to deploy in our work. So we've been working for the last 2 years in Austin, Texas, which we are treating as kind of an implementation site for pilots that we think can help demonstrate this transition away from a fossil fuel dominated energy system to one characterized by renewables and efficiency. And within mobility, basically we observed what we thought was a really exciting trend, and then we saw two other trends that we thought could be combined with that to really accelerate this transition. And I'll highlight those three trends. So the first is within mobility, we're seeing a huge increase in the number of options that are available to such a degree that you can start thinking of it as a package offering that we call mobility as a service. So instead of having a car that sits unused 95% of the time, that you drive in alone most of the time, maybe you're using Uber and Lyft. Maybe Uber and Lyft are getting you to transit more easily. And more recently, maybe you're checking out an electric scooter on your smartphone to just take that first mile connection to transit or to get from point A to point B. So as a package, we're calling this mobility as a service because it's starting to offer the same level of convenience, if not better, than what people have become used to for their personal vehicles. In addition to that, you can electrify those services more cost effectively if they're shared, right? So if people are taking Uber and Lyft all the time, the vehicle that's being used for that is accumulating miles more quickly than a personal vehicle would. And so it makes sense economically to electrify that vehicle because the fuel savings are accumulating at the same time that the miles are. And in addition to that, you have autonomous technology coming online. So this kind of exciting combination of shared electric and autonomous mobility options that are beginning to represent and is already observable as a shift from personally owned vehicles. So that's trend number one, is in mobility, away from personally owned vehicles and towards shared electric autonomous services. The second trend that we started to see was more in the built environment. So we're seeing an increase in temporary uses. I'll just sort of broadly characterize that. And basically what it's doing is making the built environment more demand responsive. So a few examples are the adoption of food trucks that are increasingly comprising a portion of the restaurant industry and a growing one. Pop-up retail, which both startup retail establishments are taking advantage of to reduce barriers to entry relative to what the investment would be in a brick and mortar operation. And established retailers are increasingly moving to pop up as a way to be more demand responsive, whether it's seasonal demand or geographic demand. Mobile health clinics, ways to offer preventive care in places that otherwise wouldn't have access, that is more of a temporary setup. And in addition to that, you're seeing an increased adoption of modular building techniques that are reducing the cost of quickly deployable microhousing, for example, and a whole set of construction techniques that are reducing the cost of some of these pop-up approaches. Combined with that, you kind of have various cities who are exhibiting more flexibility in terms of these temporary uses. So there's permitting processes that have been accelerated in certain cities. There's reinterpretation of regulation to allow temporary uses. Maybe the best example there is in Portland, where originally the setup of these food carts was illegal, but they said, well, if they're movable, then they can be characterized as commercial vehicles, and then they're not regulated the same way buildings would be. So let's just make sure they have an axle and wheels, and that way they'll become legal as food carts. And pink zones, or ways of designating parts of cities that have greater flexibility in terms of temporary uses and streamlined permitting processes. So that's kind of the second trend is the flexibility of the built environment, the demand responsiveness of the built environment, an increase in temporary uses. And then the third one is kind of where those two meet. So you have this amazing shift in mobility away from personal vehicles, you have a flexible built environment, and then you have this sort of meeting point between them, which is parking right now. And parking is where the current mobility system, as we understand it, which is of course personal vehicles, sort of meets the built environment. And as has been highlighted in this, in several talks here over the last couple of days, parking is just an insane allocation of incredibly valuable space in downtown areas. Up to 30% of space is dedicated to unused machines that are sitting there for one person to use 5% of the time. So let's think about, and that's already something that represents an opportunity because of, I'd say, the misallocation of parking in minimum parking requirements, and that's something that's been understood for a long time. But what's exciting now is that the first trend I highlighted toward mobility as a service means that we're seeing a reduction in parking demand, and so an opportunity to actually reallocate all of that space to much more valuable uses and community benefit. Okay, so we took a step back. We said, okay, there's these three things happening all concurrently. What if we mash them all up together and create a pilot project in Austin that can take advantage of these three trends, right? So that's what we did. We said, let's find an underutilized parking lot. Let's put a bunch of mobility services there and concentrate them in one place: scooters, bikes, Uber and Lyft loading zones, car share. Let's put it in a transit, an existing transit area where we can enhance access to transit. And let's also take advantage of some of these trends in the flexible built environment to do some pop-up retail, some food carts. Let's do some tactical urbanism and placemaking. Let's bring in some basic shading structures and greenery just to make these parking lots more attractive places to be. And then let's try to understand whether we can accelerate this shift away from a fossil fuel-based system toward one that's much more efficient. So we looked at it from three lenses. We wanted to reduce emissions, we wanted to enhance health, both physical and mental health, and then we wanted to enhance equity. And I'll just quickly cover each of those from a hypothetical standpoint. So these are the outcomes we hope to achieve, and we're right in the thick of this pilot, so we actually don't know whether these are going to be successful, but that's kind of the experimental spirit with which we're proceeding. But what we hope to be able to do is, of course, replace what would have been vehicle trips with walk trips by offering amenities at these parking lots that otherwise would have required a car trip to get to. And also by offering services there that can replace car trips to go beyond where we offer the services. So that's how we want to hope to reduce emissions. From a physical health standpoint, walkability is, of course, tied to cardiovascular health, as we saw in the video earlier today, and as Jill mentioned. We also have mental health benefits, as Jill went into. So social cohesion, a gathering place, a sense of community, a safe place to gather and hold public events. And there are some mental health benefits that result from that. And then from an equity standpoint, we chose a neighborhood in Austin that is low wealth and that is underserved by historical infrastructure investments to try to understand whether we could work with the mobility service providers to offer discounts to the people in that neighborhood, and also understand how and whether the community would embrace those new services. So we're right in the middle of things right now, and there's kind of two things that we hope to really get out of it. I mean, one is obviously to deliver on those three benefits, the emissions, the health, and the equity. But perhaps more importantly, we're trying to create a template and a metrics-based monitoring approach that allows cities to continue the experiment, to replicate it, and in turn deliver some immediate benefits to their communities, but continue to refine it, because there's so much uncertainty, particularly around consumer adoption, which communities are using these services and how, where they're going on these trips. A lot of this is brand new. We don't know how people are using these scooters. We know that the average trip is 1 to 2 miles. It's very short, but we don't really know what types of trips they're taking. So let's continue to gather the data. Let's continue to move toward reduced emissions, enhanced health, and improved equity, and put ourselves in a position with that flexibility to adjust along the way and deliver on those community outcomes. So I'm happy to answer additional questions about what we found in that pilot and what we're learning along the way.
To each of our speakers, and I know we got a little bit of a late start, so I'm going to mix it up a little bit. Sorry to throw everyone a curveball, but I mean, we've heard about the needs from a community perspective, especially as they're related to climate change. We've gotten a glimpse at a really cool framework for evaluating community health impacts, and we've heard about some really neat mobility interventions. Before I launch into questions with our panelists, I want to hear from you all. If you all have questions for our panelists, I'll let you guys have the first shot.
I'm fascinated by your pilot project and want to do it here. What kind of investment did Rocky Mountain Institute make to do the Austin project?
Yeah, so to go a little bit more into who supported us. So as a nonprofit, we're supported by a series of foundations. In this particular case, we are supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who is particularly interested in the health outcomes, but also, the equity and emissions reduction benefits. And the idea from, the way they looked at it was, this is a way for us to provide kind of a seed investment to make this a commercially sustainable model. So a big part of what we're doing is trying to make some relatively low-cost investments, like in the shading and the tactical urbanism sort of approach, that was really low cost. But what we hope to be able to do is demonstrate the benefit of that to particularly the landowners. So the parking owners, we're working with 2 private landowners on the parking front, and they can recover some of their holding costs by bringing in some of these new tenants who are pursuing the temporary uses. So there's a business case for them to open up their space to these temporary uses, and we're hoping to demonstrate that and make it a commercially replicable and scalable model. So our investment was really mostly time to try to pull together the value proposition to those landowners as an initial offering, and I think they already do recognize that they're recovering their holding costs as a result of some of the tenants we brought in. And also to work with the mobility service providers to say, hey, you guys should all concentrate your services here. We've negotiated discounts, but if we can show the value of doing that, they'll be motivated to do it again and again, and we can create a scalable model around that.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, my question is for Ms. Gretchen Biesing. In Miami, you talked about Liberty City, and then developers now are going to start poach or go in there and try to buy the home, so the value may not be as high as, as one would think. So are you guys doing anything to educate them or doing anything to protect the people from getting a low value that if they got $100,000 and they cannot buy a home for $300,000 anywhere, what happens? Because they're being displaced ultimately?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and unfortunately, one of the trends that we're seeing, and this is anecdotal, is that a lot of the families that are selling their homes for that lower value are moving, and the only place they can really afford to move is the southernmost part of the county, which is really disconnected from a lot of services, from transit, and it's also extremely, extremely vulnerable. It's very low-lying. That's where we see a lot of storm surge when storms do come through. So it's a very disturbing trend. Now, in terms of what we can do to fix it, something that Catalyst and the Miami Climate Alliance have been working on for years is really the community education and the training of activists, so that there are more residents that kind of understand how all of these larger issues are kind of intersecting over their community and are going to city commission meetings, for example. Like Liberty City is a neighborhood inside the city of Miami. So speaking to the city commission, speaking to the commission that runs the community redevelopment area that encompasses that part of the community, which is extra tax dollars going in for investment. We provide some leadership training to help residents feel more comfortable serving on municipal or community advisory boards, so that when those positions open up, which is usually the result of a lot of advocacy, we have residents that feel like they understand the issues and they can then serve on those boards. At a policy level, there are a number of different groups that are part of the Miami Climate Alliance that are working on ideas like community land trusts. We're in the very early stages of having conversations about a land bank or some other entity. It probably wouldn't be called a land bank because the Florida legislature has done some sneaky stuff that doesn't make land banking legal. But some sort of entity that can hold land that is turned over by the city, the county, the school district, who are the predominant landowners in our area. When they have vacant land, they can turn it over to this entity that can then use the land for preservation, building new affordable housing, creating more green space to help with mitigating flood, transit stops, that sort of thing. So these are some of the issues that we're, the higher level policy issues that we're looking at.
Hi, Jill, I appreciated seeing that conceptualization you had for well-being, but my question is actually to Greg. With the project that you're doing right now in Austin, I was wondering what are the qualitative and quantitative ways in which you're measuring the success you're making on reducing emissions, enhancing health, and enhancing equity.
Right. So we took a lot of our inspiration from Gale Institute, who has created an inclusive and healthy places framework that includes metrics to sort of measure the success of a space. It just came out a few months ago, and we were collaborating with them before they published it. So that helped us from a public space standpoint to characterize some of the health benefits. And our main data collection techniques are on-the-ground surveys, again, sort of influenced by that Gale framework, and then video observation. And a lot of what Gale does as well is just watch the way a space is being used to get a more empirical sense of whether a space is successful. So we've got a video camera set up, and of course there's no personally identifiable aspects to what we're collecting. We're just trying to get a sense of through traffic, how many people stop at the space, the degree to which and how the mobility services are being used. And then to complement our mobility services measurement, we're working with the mobility service companies to gather their data. So we're brokering data sharing agreements to understand how many trips are taken from the hub, how many end at the hub, the average trip length, things like that. And of course, we can correlate all of that to reduced emissions because of replacing car trips. You have to make some assumptions about whether the trip would have been by car. So, there's a few things we have to think about in that environment. But basically, the way we've framed it is with Gale as that starting point, that inclusive and healthy places framework, and then we added several survey questions and observation techniques and data collection components to bring the mobility measurements into play as well.
We'll take one more question, and then I want to take a moderator's privilege.
Thank you all. I have one question for any or all of the panelists. I was wondering to what capacity you're working with public health departments, and if you are not, what role you could possibly see them playing in a future.
I can start.
Oh, yeah. Who wants to start?
So right now, we actually are not working with the Miami-Dade County Public Health Department, but we certainly would like to. We have been working with different medical professional groups, both locally and at the state level, like physicians. I'm trying to remember the names of some of them, but like Physicians United Against Climate Change is one example. So there are a lot of different medical professional groups, doctors in particular, that are seeing the health impacts on a clinical level. And want to get more involved. And I would say, just from working with those groups, the issue that comes up the most in Miami, in particular, in some of the lower wealth urban neighborhoods, is that more children are coming in with asthma, and they tie that back directly to like overexposure to heat. Also, of course, like substandard housing, but they see a link between the excess heat, exposure to heat, lack of air conditioning, and proper ventilation to the increase in asthma.
So for the development of the framework that we did, we interviewed a number of health professionals, both at all three levels of government within the Canadian healthcare system, to understand what they're seeing as results of poorly thought out planning and design, to put those into the framework. And now as we start to apply it to our projects, we are seeing an increased need for demand to have people with public health experience as part of our design team, so that we're thinking about these things critically as we go forward. So it's just starting to get to a tipping point, and I think we want to continue to encourage and involve those people in the conversations to be more proactive, so we don't have to be as reactive.
And yeah, in our pilots in Austin, we did consult with the lead of the public health department that works with the city of Austin, which we're working in collaboration with. We also work with some researchers at the University of Texas at Austin who have done some really interesting work to link health to urban design. One in particular where they used Fitbits to start to measure what the level of physical activity was after a urban space intervention. So we tried to incorporate some of that thinking in our framework, but I'd say what was highlighted over and over again is that, and the example I just gave maybe illustrates this, is that the physical health components are much easier to see and understand. The cutting edge, as we understood it, as we developed our interview process, is really in the mental health arena and getting clear about how to measure that. Yes, you can say there's more social interaction, there's higher dwell time, within a public space, but how do you really translate that into mental health outcomes is kind of a cutting edge of research. So we tried to just gather data that we hope future research can help illuminate in terms of characterizing those outcomes better.
Great, thank you. Jill, I wanted to come back to you for a minute to talk about the community wellness framework and ask if you could talk a little bit about your experience actually implementing that. I would also love to hear about how, something we've talked about a lot in Louisiana is how to cultivate those partnerships between public health and planning, and so I'd love to hear how those members of your team work together.
I can give you an example of a project that we're currently working on for the province of Alberta. So I'm going to speak to that because it's a context I know about. And it's a brand new $250 million laboratory building to consolidate all of the health testing that needs to be done within the province of Alberta. And so at the beginning of the project, we did a charrette using the community wellbeing framework as the basis for the charrette, so much more holistic than a lead charrette or a community engagement charrette. And there were stakeholders that were part of the project team, but also from the health authority, from the city of Edmonton, from the surrounding communities. And we looked at the project through the lens of the community wellbeing framework. So yes, it's this inward-facing, very technical medical facility that has a very specific program, but how is it going to contribute to the wellness of the city within the different scales? So the building itself, the people that work in the building, its connections to the surrounding neighborhoods, its connections to the surrounding city, and that really led to a very different design than I think anyone had originally intended. And it was a bit of an experiment, and we had a very conservative client group that wasn't necessarily interested in having that conversation, but it led to the project being located next to a light rail transit hub. It's got walking trails now that plug it into the surrounding neighborhood. It's got a whole bunch of different sustainability features in the building to capture energy, looking at net zero. And then it's created a bunch of publicly accessible spaces within the campus itself so that the community can come in and have that shared sense of space and wellness. So I think that's a really tangible example, and this is pretty new for us, so this is a pretty new project example that I think we're looking at how does this actually work and how can we translate it.
Are there, for those of us who are, it's very new, what were some of the lessons learned as you implemented this for the first few times? Were there challenges that came up that you weren't anticipating?
One of the lessons we learned, I think, is building capacity for all the participants. So it's really important that they understand, what we're asking of them, how they can be involved, and how their input is going to be used. So we had to spend time building knowledge and capacity with our clients, but with also the stakeholder groups about, well, what is the point of this? Why is community well-being important? Why should we care how this very specific project is going to benefit the broader city? And so I think we did this charrette 3 different times and broadening our participant group each time, and that was really important to allow people to fully understand what was the goal of the project and be open to challenging the specific parameters. Oftentimes as consultants, we're handed a program and said, you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and through this process, sometimes we're asking our clients and our stakeholders to say, well, actually, we're going to do 1, 2, 3, Z, MNO instead. So it's very different. So I think spending that time helping people understand the process is really important.
That makes sense. I'm going to ask one more quick question, and then we'll take one more audience question. Greg, so this one's for you. We know that blight affects both physical and mental health, in the sense that it can discourage active transportation and other outdoor recreation. It can also have a negative impact on mental health. Could you talk a little bit about how some of these solutions you've talked about, the flexible built environment and this kind of experimental approach, could be used as a blight reduction strategy?
Yeah, so if you're kind of looking at it from a system perspective, which is perhaps what a city would do, and looking at places in a city where these approaches would be most beneficial, there's certainly an opportunity to encourage concentration of, let's say, mobility services in a particular area by offering some incentives to those mobility service companies, in addition to inviting temporary use by offering regulatory flexibility of the kind that I mentioned before. So saying, hey, and pink zones is probably one of the best examples of this, where cities are in a position to say, we are going to designate this particular area as streamlined in terms of the permitting processes that temporary users would normally have to face. And if you kind of combine that with those mobility services, yes, this could be a way to address blight in particular parts of the city and target that. But I just want to emphasize too that even though a city might be in a position to have sort of a high-level view of where this might be most beneficial, I think it's also beneficial to see what kinds of uses might emerge and be open to unexpected outcomes there. So looking to landowners again to say, hey, do you guys have ideas for ways that you could repurpose this? Do you see value in this? And then the temporary, let's say the temporary users, the people who would want to put up pop-up retail or medical health, mobile health clinics, or whatever the use case may be, give them the freedom to offer these services where they would either like to or where there's the greatest demand for them. And I think we'll see some unexpected solutions emerge from that. So what we're trying to do is just clarify that value to all the different parties involved. Who's using the space, who has the space, and how can we kind of connect them together and allow them to transact in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. We're sort of taking this to the next level. Maybe like there's an Airbnb for underutilized urban space, and sort of a marketplace where if you're a pop-up retail provider, you can go to a single database and see where there's land available and make your own decisions, and then be able to connect to the landowner and transact and negotiate a price for that. So yeah, there's sort of a central planning sort of approach, but there's also maybe a less predictable market-driven approach that could be really interesting there.
Very cool. Do we have one more question from the audience? Okay, well, we're about out of time anyway, so I will just to recap, I think we've had a great conversation that's covered many different aspects of the merging of planning and public health and the way those two disciplines can work together to create community wellness. And I want to thank all of our panelists and thank you all for attending.